Welcome back to the special series of symbolic expression. We have been discussing Introduction to Environmental Economics lecture series. Under this, we were discussing about the utilitarian perspective. Before that, we have already covered Rolgian welfare function and social choice mechanism. Now let's move on to the utilitarian perspective. We have seen the Rolgian welfare function and the arrow's impossibility theorem. We have seen that it is difficult to come to a social choice that is reflective of choice of all individuals belonging to the society. Utilitarian perspective. Deriving social choice using utility function assumes that the basic individual values could be represented by a single utility function. Also, we could make social decisions using this utility function or functions and assorted the social choice mechanism such as majority rule, supermajority voting, or the Pareto Criterion, which we have already discussed. Is there any way of finding, using the utility functions, the social choice? So, under utilitarian perspective, we have seen using that has been discussed in lecture series 8 also. There has been a criteria of utilitarian perspective which says that there are a lot of limitations to this particular approach. One criticism is based on the assumption that we all have the utility functions that represent preferences and they are immutable. However, it is also pointed out that the people change their optimal or their opinions over time. It is very, very natural to happen. Advertising plays a very important critical role in changing and influencing our preferences. Consequently, if environment is not highly valued by the individual, then the information system, then the education programs, they can be used to increase the importance of environment to those individuals. But if it is so easy to change someone's preference, then what utility function should be used and what utility function should be adopted to make any public policy? That becomes a very difficult question and a dilemma. Another criticism to this particular approach of utilitarian is that not all affected individuals are included in many voting processes. There are many unborn who do not vote but are affected by the actions that impact the long-term environmental quality. Basically, they are pointing out to the generation which is unborn and the future generation. Utilitarian approach was articulated by Sagoff in 1994, who questioned whether the public policy should be based on individual preference rather than the concept what is right. Shouldn't there be an ethical judgment behind any public policy? Should it only reflect the choices of individual? Should it only reflect the choice of the society? So that becomes an ethical value judgmental question. Another issue related to the utilitarian approach was raised by Sagoff in again 1994, is that while voting, we assume or we often think differently than when we are making a private decision. Private decisions are made under the market circumstances of demand and supply. And monetary is the basic background behind the choices. However, when you are voting, there is a pressure of the whole society and your peer groups members. When voting, we may consciously or subconsciously put ourselves in the role of a public policy maker. When we are voting for some cause, we tend to think differently in comparison to when we are actually making choices under the personal choices under the market system. So, rather than of an individual expressing the individual preference, it becomes as a conscious decision for society's point of view. How the outcome. Now, this is basically with these criticism, we move on to the next subtopic, which is environmental decision making problems. Still, we are on the process of solving the environmental decision making problems. How the outcome differs depends on the social choice mechanism adopted by the society, and the composition of the society itself makes a huge difference when it comes to the outcome of environmental decision. Irrespective of what methodology or what theoretical background we have been discussing, when it actually comes of finding out, resolving the environmental decision and making a public policy using a particular mechanism, then the composition of society makes a huge difference. If the society comprises of biocentricists or anthropologists, so it all depends what kind of members in the society we are talking about. And that creates a huge difference while making a decision and the outcome of environmental decision being opted by the public policy. There are several instances and there are several case studies to reflect that particular difference in the decision making that is highlighted under the various case studies. Here in this lecture we are going to discuss 3 critical and important case studies. First case study would be air pollution in Santiago. Let's move on to the air pollution problem in Santiago, which is an environmental pollution problem, The issue is how much of the reduction in the air pollution to be pursued with the polluters bearing the cost and possibly passing on the cost to the customers. So basically we are trying to identify that quantity of pollution or air pollution to be reduced. Unless the polluters are the individuals polluting from their driving cars. So it is possible to pass on the cost of reducing the pollution to the customers if they are not the owners of the car driving. Basically, the case when the pollution is mainly because of vehicles and the owners of the vehicles are driving the car, then it cannot be passed on. Otherwise, if the mediatory or the polluter is different from the customer, then it can be easily passed on. On the basis of the Pareto criterion, now what are we going to do under each case study? We are going to apply all the criterion we have discussed, mechanism, social choice mechanism under the environmental issues. So here in these case studies which we are going to discuss now, there are 3 environmental related issues. Each problem we will apply a particular social choice mechanism and we will see how the choice of mechanism, social choice mechanism, will come up with a different outcome under each case. Now, under the air pollution case of Santiago, we are going to apply Pareto criteria, then we are going to apply a majority rule and also the voting criteria, and then see how the outcome will differ and vary. On the basis of Pareto criterion, the status quo will persist. It basically means that it is unlikely that any amount of pollution control will happen. However, it will be supported by 100% of population of Santiago, this particular outcome will prevail. The poorest member of the population will be unwilling to bear the increased transportation cost due to the pollution control necessary to increase the air quality. Given the fact or assuming that the air quality is getting harmed or deteriorated due to the transportation, and if the state or the government public policy is to increase the transportation cost, how many members in your society are going to pay for it, increased transportation cost? So, Pareto Criterion principle would state that under this criterion, no pollution control would be pursued. So, basically, the entire population of Santiago will not be paying for the cost of pollution. Now, let's move on to the second criteria or the social mechanism, social choice mechanism, which is a compensation principle, which we discussed. With the compensation, let us see how the outcome will vary. The outcome will be very different. If the wealthy feel strongly about the pollution control and about cleaning up the pollution, then they can mobilize significant resources to make the transfer to the rest of the population to make the pollution control unanimously very attractive. So, this is one way in which the outcome, desirable outcome can be attained with the help of the compensation principle in Santiago. The compensation principle indicates that pollution control is unanimously attractive and should be pursued, even though decreased pollution levels and increased transportation cost may leave some of the people worse off. There will be some people who are paying for the cost will definitely have to depart and will be in a worse off situation, but the overall outcome will be favorable and desirable for the whole society. That is compensation principle outcome for the same problem. So, Pareto criterion, we saw that it did not work, it will not reduce the pollution. However, the compensation criteria or the principle will work and will lead to an outcome which is a reduced pollution. Let's take another criteria or the social choice mechanism, which is majority rule voting. Let us try that under the same problem of air pollution in Santiago. Majority rule voting. The outcome here depends upon the composition of the population. A population with a large number of poor people may not support significant pollution reduction if they have to pay more vital services such as transportation cost, which is very critical expenditure for them. If they have to pay extra amount for that, then they would not be ready for this. And when it comes to voting, only a modest pollution is likely to be supported by the majority people. So there is a way. So this particular criteria or mechanism will lead to an outcome which is a modest pollution control, because given the condition that the population is a poor population, the final outcome could be a modest pollution control. Now, majority rule principle, voting principle, if the pollution is better off or feels deeply committed to committed to clean the environment, people living in the society in that region are better off and they feel committed for controlling the pollution and they support the public policy, then if a super majority is needed to make that social decision to happen, which is 2/3 majority, then the pollution control adopted is likely to be modest than under the simple majority rule. More modest means the kind of pollution reduction you must expect with a supermajority case where people, 2/3 of the majority is there and people are willing to pay for better quality of environment, then we will have a better result under the majority rule voting principle. So supermajority principle will work when we have more population towards environmental quality. Different outcomes will result from a different set of preferences on the part of population and different social mechanism. Both of them are playing an important role. The type of population we are talking about and the type of social mechanism we are talking about. If the analysis of an environmental problem concludes that only a modest level of pollution control is justified and the blame can be placed either on the method of analysis, social choice rule, or underlying preferences of the population. We move on to the second case study of environmental decision making. The second case study is the study of the California gnatcatcher. Gnatcatcher is a bird. The issue of protecting that habitat of endangered California bird which nests in highly valued coastal land in southern California. The proposed under the consideration is to buy all the coastal land. The proposal of the government is that to buy all the coastal land and set it aside for the habitat protection. That includes a huge investment on part of the government. So government has two options for this. Option A, a percentage income tax surcharge on the wealthiest 10% of the population is being implemented. This is the first option with the government or the state to protect the bird. Second option is option B, which can be a uniform per person tax which is applied to all population members or members of the society uniformly. Either you tax them uniformly, every population, every member of the society, or you just tax the 10% wealthiest population. Let us see which option would be more favorable for the social outcome. Here also in this case study of California gnatcatcher, we apply the three social choice mechanisms. Pareto Criterion. Now, if we look at Pareto Criterion, it is not of much help in this particular case. Neither of the option is supported by Pareto. For the Pareto Criterion to be fulfilled, the entire population should come up with one particular well-being. So 100% of the population will not support either of the option A and B or A or B. The population consists of committed biocentrists. Even the richest 10% might agree that the protection is good idea. Then also it is not 100% because it only the 10% people are agreeing to that. Thus option A would be kind of favored. It is unlikely that option B could be unanimously favored because the poorest member of the population would likely to find head tax as not favorable to them. So in the case when option A is applied, when 10% of the wealthiest population are paying and given the condition that they are towards preserving the bird, then only that option A would be favorable and give the social outcome, favorable social outcome. Let us see about the compensation criteria. Under the compensation criteria, the two options, option A and B, they become identical, since the resources will move from those supporting the habitat preservation to those opposing it. However, the future generation of Southern California may be more than willing to compensate for the setting aside the funds for the habitat. Their preferences are unknown, unfortunately, and the method are imperfect for transferring the resources from the future to the present. So that becomes a technical, practical problem of making this criteria work. Next, we move on to another criteria of social choice mechanism, which is majority rule, under the same case study of California Natchcacker. Now, under this, if we apply the majority rule, then option A would pass the majority rule. Majority rule here is for 90% of the population, the proposal has no cost. While option B might or might not be supported by the majority rule, depending upon how strongly the population feels about protecting the endangered species. A population of biocentrists could undoubtedly signify the majority in support of the option B. Option B, which is uniformity of paying with charge and distributing it equally. So the population which is biocentric could undoubtedly signify the majority support of option B. Consequently, one can see even a simple issue of protecting a species can be a society's desirable or undesirable outcome depending upon the subtle changes in the preferences and changes in the social choice mechanism. So, the outcome of whether to protect the species or not to protect the species, that is completely dependent upon the type of social choice mechanism you have selected. Secondly, on the type of population ideology, the type of population philosophy of population regarding the social environmental issue makes a difference. The last three gorgeous dam, protecting dam will generate electricity and provide flood control for the coming decades to promote the Chinese economic development. Eventually, the dam will fill with silt and from that point on provide a little benefit. Then the loss of the river will be for all time. So, based on the Pareto criterion, the dam should not be built. Voting principle here says that if present and future generations are voting, then unanimity will not be reached, and unanimity is required to pass any Pareto test. Compensation principle is little ambiguous in this particular case of Three Gorges Dam. It is not possible for future generation to transfer resources to the present generation and compensate the present generation to build the dam. It is likely that future generation of Chinese will be wealthier than the current generation and would be able to pay considerable amount as compensation. If we consider majority rule principle, then we include all future generation in the list of eligible voters and majority rule voting against the dam. Finally, the complex environmental policy question will be resolved in different ways depending upon the type of social choice mechanism adopted. So, in this we'll conclude this lecture. In this lecture, we have overviewed the notion of Rolgian utility function, various criteria of social choice mechanism have been discussed, concept of Arrow's impossibility theorem was discussed, and utility principle with its criticism has been discussed. Finally, we have seen in these examples, three examples, that resolving environmental problems and policies by using social choice mechanism have been discussed in the lecture. Thank you for the patience.